Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning into today's show. It should be a fantastic midweek. Happy hump day to you all. Happy Wednesday. And for all you fantasy football heavy heads, this show is going to be for you. We start off today's show talking about kind of how to maximize the value. So if your drafts are coming up, maximizing the value specifically of your draft position, whether you're a high round draft pick or you're picking in the middle of the round, through rounds 1 through 2, I've got you covered on some of the guys who can be those value picks for you coming up. Then I'm also going to be looking at some hidden gems per round, rounds 1 through 4, and then also, I'm going to be breaking down some of the tiers in certain position groups, starting off with the QBs and running backs, and finishing off with some really deep sleepers. Those are the guys who you are probably going to be taking flyers on if you are that brave to in the latter stages of the rounds. But before we begin, as more people come into this live stream, I do want to remind all those that will be watching the show that if you do feel so inclined, this show is meant to be based around you. So please make sure to avail yourselves to the super chat, super thanks, and super stickers. All of these new uses now that we are a YouTube live show that will greatly support me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you do, whether it be leaving a message in the chat, burning question, comment, or concern, even a fantasy trade. We got a fantastic one yesterday that I analyzed for him. We will do everything to make sure that your viewing experience is great, and we want to keep you around as our faithful audience. So anything greatly appreciated using these super chats, super thanks, and super stickers that are available on YouTube. But without further ado, let us jump right into today's show, starting off with our first segment of the day being that maximizing value pick right here. And so what with the advent of fantasy football drafts is starting to come hot and heavy, drafting has always been seen as a certain philosophy concerning picks. But I want to warn you that while it feels good to have, say, the number 1 pick or a pick 1 through 3 where you know it's basically chalk going forward with those picks, it's better to have a plan in terms of adding value, so it's not just, I'm picking a high-end guy who I know will be a high draft pick, but also maximizing that draft pick so I don't look silly by being the number 1 pick but not having a good team around that number 1 pick. So for rounds 1 through 2, I'm going to have you covered with some guys and with a plan, most importantly, that will set you up for success in your fantasy draft. So let's start off with the number 1 overall pick. And you should feel good if you have the number 1 overall pick, because you are probably getting the best all-purpose player in fantasy terms. Christian McCaffrey, Run CMC, the consensus favorite, obviously led fantasy in points per game last year, and in terms of running backs, 100.8 points more than any other running back in fantasy last year. That just goes to show that even, with all the talk of his injury history, whether he can stay healthy, how he's going to fit in if Brock Purdy is not living up to par, those questions quickly will fall away once you are in the number 1 draft pick. And you should take Christian McCaffrey. I think that is the easiest pick. I remember in a mock draft I did earlier, someone for some reason picked Breece Hall number 1 overall. I think that was a very silly pick just because Christian McCaffrey at the current moment is the better running back and the better choice and better value at number 1. But to each their own. But I'm telling you right now, pick 1, round 1 should be Christian McCaffrey. And then in the second round, that's where it kind of gets interesting. If you're the first pick in the second round, you have a lot available to you, and you can take many different paths. If you're someone who likes the hero running back strategy, for example, do you pounce on that second tier, which we'll talk about later, of running backs, or do you take one of the wide receivers? Because if we think about it, the wide receiver market, in my opinion, is less wide open than the running back market, because the second round is where you find the meat of the running backs. You find the Pachecos of the world, the ETNs, maybe the Henrys, even though I don't necessarily think he will be that good of a value in round 2. You get all of that in round 2, and if you're the first pick, you can kind of set the tone for the rest of the latter half of the round. So if you take a Pacheco or an ETN, I think that you're doing something clever in that you're blocking off other value running backs from falling further down in the draft, and it's a very astute move. However, if you choose to go the way of the wide receiver, and this is something I did myself in picking 2 wide receivers first, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how you evaluate the wide receivers, because there is a huge kind of drop-off, because I, going into my draft, didn't really expect to take a wide receiver, but it was kind of forced on me as I had the 5th pick, and we'll get to that in a minute as well. But it did ultimately fall the way where it made more sense to me, at the very least, to pick a wide receiver as well in round 2. But going forward, I think that the value here is picking one of those second-tiered running backs to kind of set yourself up with 2 running backs, kind of the meat of your team going forward, most importantly for the season, and setting that foundation where now more people have less opportunity to steal kind of those players and those mindsets away from you. Let's go to pick 2, because pick 2 is where things get a little bit more wide open. You have your choice of either setting the tone as a hero running back draft by selecting Breece Hall, who already has had in his career over 25 games of 20 plus yards. I think that you can really set the tone if it's going to be a running back heavy draft you feel like, or you can pick one of the top 2 wide receivers in Tyreek Hill or CeeDee Lamb. And I think that if you choose either Hill or Lamb, that is where, more people will be attuned to your strategy. So I think picking Breece Hall here would be the biggest move moving forward for you, because it sets the tone that the running back market, will get pretty much swallowed up before the end of the second round pretty quickly. The wide receiver market, however, will linger a little bit should you choose to go Hall, and I think that's the most valuable pick. However, if you choose Tyreek Hill or CeeDee Lamb, it kind of muddies the path forward for more people to take risks on that second tier of wide receivers a little bit, because if you're taking a high-end wide receiver, that kind of means you're setting a weird tone, because like I said, the wide receiver market's more wide open, but it's ultimately up to you. It's just my opinion that Hall should be the second pick and not the first, like that one person in my mock draft. Then we get to pick 3. That's where you open up. That's where you could finally start to think about wide receivers as well, because it makes a lot of sense. The top 2 running backs are off the board. You don't necessarily want to jump the gun and take a guy kind of in the second tier of running backs just yet, so you go for a CeeDee Lamb or a Tyreek Hill. I was saying Lamb. Now that his whole contract situation is figured out and the whole holdout isn't being held over his head, I think it's safe to say that CeeDee Lamb will have a big season. He is the centerpiece of that Cowboys offense. And as pick 3, I think it makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't be surprised if Tyreek Hill goes there as well, but CeeDee Lamb will be my pick. Because I think he is more important as a whole to the Dallas Cowboys, thus creating more opportunities for target share. The question's there. And B, I just think that the Miami Dolphins are predicated on the main number 1 trait and reason why Tyreek Hill is so coveted, and that is speed. And eventually that will come back to bite them as well. I'm not as high on the Miami Dolphins as an overall fantasy team as Shep Easy's Lit Vids for Lit Kids says CeeDee not as hungry as he was, take off 200 yards and 3 tutties. I kind of disagree with that sentiment. I agree in terms of he probably won't get as much touchdown production, because I think that the Dallas Cowboys red zone offense will become more predicated on getting the ball to their tight end, Jake Ferguson. I think that as a red zone threat, Jake Ferguson is very interesting to look at. But CeeDee Lamb, I don't think it's a question of hungriness. It's just a question of necessity for the Cowboys. They knew, even though they waited as long as they did for that contract extension to come, that CeeDee Lamb was going to set the standard for them in offense. And he was going to be the most important member of that offense. That is why they locked him up before Dak. Probably, in my humble opinion. That being said, I kind of agree with the sentiment that CeeDee Lamb certainly has a lot more attention when the Cowboys open up the playbook. And this year's going to look a little bit weirder because Kellen Moore, I'm not necessarily certain how he's going to utilize Dak Prescott. He has utilized, actually I believe that the Cowboys offensive coordinator is Brian Schottenheimer, who before worked with Russell Wilson in Seattle actually, and he uses a lot of schemes that use the deep pass. And to your understanding, Shep Easy's Lit Vids for Lit Kids, you're saying the yardage is going to be a little bit more of a problem than the touchdowns. And I agree with that. But I think that the playbook is more open for CD, if that makes sense, with a more open field. When it gets to the red zone, that's the question. That's where the questions emerge, in my humble opinion, for the Cowboys offense. But fantastic comment. I like one half of it, but I can't agree with the overarching sentiment of it all. But it is a fascinating comment to contemplate. But moving along in terms of picking out names in these drafts, pick 4. That's where I think a lot of things open up. You can pick either one of Bijan Robinson, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, even Tyreek Hill if he's still available. And then you can also kind of find the way to, if you do take a wide receiver, justify taking another one in the latter half, because then you have guys like Mike Evans, Chris Olave, maybe even a Michael Pittman, a Marvin Harrison Jr., even if you're that ambitious. So I would say out of all of these, Jefferson would be the best pick at number 4 overall, because he kind of sets the precedent, as Shep Easy's Lit Vids for Lit Kids saying, I just think he is not a number 3. I believe you were alluding to CeeDee Lamb, so let's go back to CeeDee Lamb again. I think that in the realm of fantasy football, you aren't necessarily correct, but in real life, yes. CeeDee Lamb would not be viewed as a quote-unquote number 3 best wide receiver in the NFL. I think there are a couple guys better than him. I think that ultimately Tyreek Hill is better than him. Justin Jefferson, you can make the case for Jamar Chase, and you can make the case for a couple of guys. But analyzing this through fantasy football terms, I think the fact that when you look at the landscape of the Cowboys offense, and you look at how important he is in that regard to them, then translate to what that means as a wide receiver in fantasy, that kind of heightens his profile. I would say that you are correct in analyzing him just by seeing him in real life. Because if we were to compare him in real life to the people I've just mentioned, he wouldn't necessarily stack up. But this is fantasy we're talking about here, and I think that ultimately when you're strategizing, you kind of want to set the tone where, even though you might be questioning why CeeDee Lamb is going this high in real life, it certainly gets the gears going in your mind to prepare yourself what's to come in the latter stages of your draft. Because if he does go 3, what does that mean for the overarching wide receiver market? This is a fantastic comment because it really opens up a lot of avenues. Should CeeDee Lamb, like I said, go number 3 in most drafts? I'm not saying that anyone should pick him number 3. I'm just saying that he seems like the most likely number 3 pick. And in fantasy terms, it's because of that heightened profile that he's seen as that number 3. But that is a fantastic comment. Thank you for it, Shep Easy's Lit Vids for Lit Kids. I just want to conclude by saying if you are picking kind of in the 3 to 4, it does open up a lot if you pick a running back or a wide receiver, because then in the second round, it gives you the advantage. That should just about do it before we go, Shep Easy's Lit Vids for Lit Kids says yet again, okay, let's let Lamb go. Who else you looking at? I believe you're talking about the first round. I think in the first round, the players who I'm most comfortable outside of Lamb picking in terms of the wide receiver market are your Tyreek Hill, not CeeDee Lamb actually, Justin Jefferson, and perhaps Jamar Chase. Because those, and we'll talk about this in a later segment when we get to wide receiver tiers, those three guys are perhaps the only guys I feel comfortable saying in a wide receiver lens are the guys going forward who I would be comfortable swinging for the fences on. Because I'm not a guy who really likes the superstar wide receiver, if you catch my drift. I'm the guy who likes balance. So, for example, let me give you my top two receivers, the guys who I picked 1 and 2 respectively in back-to-back rounds. My picks were Amon-Ra St. Brown and Garrett Wilson. Those are two guys who you wouldn't necessarily call superstars, right? But they're guys who add balance to your team. They add value to your team. Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's still a fantastic wide receiver. First team All-Pro last year. Garrett Wilson, a lot of hope surrounding him if Aaron Rodgers truly can be a QB that elevates his game. So it's all about finding balance. That being said, there are some people who like that superstar level. They go for the Tyreek Hill. They go for the Justin Jefferson. It's all about how you view these guys. I view it from a sense of, okay, if I'm kind of in a position where I have to pick a wide receiver, I'm not going to swing for the fences. I want to get the most balance I can out of the position. But also I'm looking at it from a lens of, okay, if I were in, say, a position like a third or fourth pick, I could be convinced that I should take Jefferson, because I would probably look silly if not. But since I was the fifth pick, I said, okay, I can take someone like an Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's still going to get me a lot of points, and then strategize for the latter half of the draft, if that makes a lot of sense. I really like that question. Thank you for it. But that should just about do it for this segment. Thank you for the questions. Keep them coming as the show goes on. But coming up for our next segment, we're going to be looking at some hidden gems for every round through rounds 1 through 4 and some guys who you should think about for your drafts. We'll be right back after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind that to all those who are viewing the show right now, if you do feel so inclined, throughout any portion of today's show, you can make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube, and you can become a part of the show. We've already got some fantastic interaction from our first segment, so I want to keep it going. This is a very fantasy-heavy show, so I do appreciate that sentiment. We are going to stick with this little graphic right here and talk about some hidden gems for our second segment in each round. Now, we've already talked about how to maximize the value of wherever you are drafting. This segment is more about how to interpret the goings-on of the draft, the future of your draft, through the hidden value within it. We talked about some of these guys in this other segments, so this is kind of a reiteration, but these are the guys who I believe will be a hidden gem for you wherever you are picking through rounds 1 through 4, which should be a good setup for you because those are the big rounds where you're building the meat of your team. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off in round 1, we talked about this guy before. It's Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson, everyone was clamoring last year for him to get more usage, but to no avail. Raheem Morris saying this year that Bijan Robinson will get more usage in the system. Last year, Arthur Smith kind of built like this weird thing between him and Tyler Algier. He did have a decent year, had a lot of good scrimmage yards, but this year in a new-look offense with Kirk Cousins leading the way, but with all these young weapons hungry and ready to go, Bijan, out of all of them, looks like the best one for your fantasy team, especially in round 1 when you are kind of in the middle of the pack, like I said, because we already know who pick 1, who pick 2, and maybe even who pick 3 is. But after that, it's really up to you to write your own path in terms of how the fantasy draft goes. And if you pick Bijan Robinson, I think that it will set forth this massive wave of panic in terms of, okay, how am I going to analyze the next tier of running backs that are going to be off the board? And so picking Bijan Robinson really sets a precedent because he's also someone, A, who's young, B, who has raw potential and isn't necessarily someone who's solidified as a superstar. So you really are taking that risk. And B, it also sets up a way for you to either stick with a plan, because if you pick Bijan Robinson, that could go along with the lines of a hero running back plan for you. But also, it could lead you to do many divergent things because Bijan also has a lot of upside receiving. And so you might want to pick a receiver next, because if you think Bijan adds value receiving, then you may wait to take another running back. So Bijan certainly adds a lot of value to your draft, and it certainly adds a lot of value to what your draft will look like in return. Then in round 2, this guy is a guy who I picked up myself. A lot of chatter, both positive and negative, have been surrounding him, especially in fantasy terms. But ultimately, I think that he will have a fantastic season. It is Garrett Wilson, because he is in that second tier of wide receivers, like I was saying. And the reason why he's so special is because when we think about those second tiers of wide receivers, where your Drake Londons, your Mike Evans, maybe your Chris Olaves come into play, these are all guys, apart from maybe Mike Evans a little bit, who have had inconsistent quarterback play but have still elevated their games. And Garrett Wilson stands out. Last year, let's talk about his target rate. He was 4th among wide receivers in targets. That's crazy. That's how much the Jets value him, even though they had the offense and personnel to really distribute the ball even more outside of him. So that was really stood out to me, and it should stand out in round 2 when the wide receiver market is going to be called into play here. And so Garrett Wilson kind of sets the tone for a style of wide receiver like I was talking about that adds balance to your team, because who knows if Aaron Rodgers will really be the guy that elevates Garrett Wilson's game. This offense is really going to go how Aaron Rodgers goes, and if he's not up to par, then perhaps this pick will look silly, and perhaps me telling you this will look silly. But Garrett Wilson is certainly someone to think about as we get into that second tier, second round of wide receivers, especially if you have already taken someone like a Bijan Robinson at the running back position and are starting to think, well, if I want to add more value in terms of getting a balanced wide receiver, then why not pick Garrett Wilson? Then in round 3, another wide receiver who I really like, who I also mentioned in this kind of chat with you, Mike Evans. Mike Evans may not even fall to round 3. That's how good I think he is. But because of his age, perhaps because of these new exciting young receivers with new quarterbacks, perhaps he will fall to round 3. but he's still a paragon of consistency. He was still 10th in fantasy points in his age 30 season. He is someone who just adds value to wherever he goes. And I think about him in terms of not just age, but how he profiles in the Bucs offense, right? Because when I think of the Bucs offense, they certainly profile as one that's very balanced as well. But that being said, Mike Evans is still the most consistent target in that system. And so when I think about the broader landscape of the drafts, if you're in round 3 and you have already selected either a running back or wide receiver, and B 2 running backs, now you really got to start thinking, okay, now I have to take a chance on a wide receiver. And you don't want to get into that panic mode. So having someone like Mike Evans, if he is still on the table, that will really help ease your mind if you have this idea of, okay, I really need to think about picking a wide receiver, but not someone who you know is just either overrated or someone who I'm underrating a little bit too much. So Mike Evans is kind of like the Goldilocks wide receiver. He's just right for where his average draft position has him. And then for round 4, this is a guy who might get a little bit of skepticism, might get a little bit of criticism. But I think that in round 4, when the bets are off in your fantasy drafts, you're kind of thinking about, okay, you already have your top skill position set. You probably already have a wide receiver. So why not get a guy who just could be consistency and could be a surprise? Because this is where sometimes you find the most value out of surprises than any other round in the draft, and that is Alvin Kamara. Now, he's in his age 29 season right now. He is getting up there in age, well, with the Henrys of the world. But last year was still 3rd amongst running backs in fantasy points per game, and he has been top 5 amongst running backs in terms of targets throughout all of the 7 seasons he's played in the league. And so Alvin Kamara, to me, just adds a lot of value, A, because much like any wide receiver, he has an inconsistent quarterback, and B, he makes a lot of sense for that either flex or first bench position if you've already selected your 2 running backs. As T-Money says, I'm back with another trade. I need your opinion. Yesterday, T-Money brought up a trade in the chat, so I'll be glad to offer you any trade advice. So hit me right away, my friend, and we'll get to that. But for now, let's talk about Kamara. Kamara is someone who I feel like is going to be someone who is a safe pick. He's not going to be a guy who breaks the internet with the pick. A lot of people will be surprised by it, but he's a safe pick if you already have your kind of stability set for your draft. Now, in order to really understand the overarching sentiment of what this means in rounds 1 through 4, if all of these players are picked according to their draft position, you really have to understand what you want to do and what other people are thinking you will do based off your draft slot. It's all about the chess game here, because if you're picking in the middle of the round, will already have known what has happened, and it's already set in stone what's happened, as the trade from T-Money has come in. He has said a 10-man PPR. He has, I believe this is his team, he has Christian McCaffrey, James Conner, Drake London, Ayuk, Sam Laporta, Amari Cooper, and Xavier Worthy. And he's saying, should I trade Conner, Ayuk, and Cooper for Pittman and Josh Jacobs, and I'll start Palmer in my flex? And I believe that is Joshua Palmer that he is talking about. So yesterday, he had a trade where I believe it was Conner, London, and Laporta for a bunch of NFC East guys, and Saquon, A.J. Brown, and Jake Ferguson, if I'm not mistaken. And this time around, you are asking to trade Conner, Ayuk, and Cooper for Pittman and Josh Jacobs. and starting Joshua Palmer in your flex. Let's talk about the Joshua Palmer in the flex for a little bit. I think you need to let go of Joshua Palmer because you need to find someone who will add value to your flex spot. And Joshua Palmer, as much as I like him, he probably profiles as the wide receiver 1 in the Los Angeles Chargers system. I just think that Jim Harbaugh will not have him, will focus on passing the ball. And so I think that you might need to go out, find someone on the waiver wire to replace Josh Palmer. Release him. Getting to the trade. Connor, we talked about yesterday. An interesting profile. Like you said, Connor was a top 5 running back when Kyler Murray was healthy. Brandon Ayuk, the guy who everyone's been talking about this offseason. If he stays with the San Francisco 49ers, I think he will actually be a very productive wide receiver, even though they have a wealth of talent at their disposal there. And then Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is also someone who's gotten a lot of controversy because he's getting older, and a Brown system that, wants to center around Deshaun Watson getting better. I don't think that Amari Cooper's the answer there. So, in this trade, Ayuk and Cooper, I really like that you are thinking of getting rid of them. But James Conner is where this kind of throws me off because I think that Conner is a good piece. Looks like a very young team. You have London, Laporta, and Worthy, so you have a lot of young pieces here. And then in return, getting Pittman and Josh Jacobs. Michael Pittman Jr., let's talk about him for a little bit. I really think that this year is going to be crucial for him because Anthony Richardson is going to need someone at the wide receiver 1 position. That being said, since Anthony Richardson is such a versatile, volatile quarterback, I'm not sure how Michael Pittman, who doesn't necessarily profile as a true wide receiver 1, and his stats in terms of route running haven't necessarily shown that to this point, is going to fit that profile. And then Josh Jacobs moving to Green Bay. Yes, I like that move, and I think it will kind of create pastures anew for him, getting out of whatever tension was happening in Las Vegas. But if you look at the Packers, even under Matt LaFleur, going back to the Mike McCarthy era, they haven't really had that many running backs who have gotten that many touches. And so this time around, I'm also dissuading you from this trade because even though Ayuk and Cooper, yes, are players who you should think about getting rid of, I still think Pittman and Josh Jacobs are in very, very tough situations in terms of how their offensive profile and setup. That right now, if you were to take Connor out of the equation, maybe I'll be comfortable with it. But with the profile of your overarching team, your youth in this team, the London, who's profiling to probably get the most targets he's ever had, Sam Laporta, still the tight end 1 no matter how bad of a tight end 1 season it was last year. Xavier Worthy can add a lot of depth for you, even dropping him down to the flex position. A great gadget guy who will be used in so many different ways in both the Chiefs' offense and maybe even in special teams. I think that this trade as well you might want to shy away from. Thank you for giving me this trade analysis, T-Money. You have been the man in terms of asking for trade advice. I hope that this is helping you in many different ways. That being said, we are going to take a quick break. Before we go to quick break, he has another presentation here. T-Money saying, what if I try to change it to A.J. Brown and K9 Kenneth Walker? Now that trade will be interesting because we talked about A.J. Brown yesterday as well in that trade proposal. A.J. Brown, yes, the Philadelphia Eagles offense kind of goes under the radar, but I think that this year will be all about getting Jalen Hurts comfortable, and A.J. Brown is more of a deep threat quarterback, even though he is a wide receiver 1. And then Kenneth Walker, I actually do like Kenneth Walker, and it's not just my Seattle Seahawks bias, but he also is someone who last year, even though Seattle has always been a rushing team, he did not profile as that. So I think that if you try to change that to A.J. Brown and K9, then it will make a little bit more sense because the risk won't be as big. And I think that it's kind of more like for like. But keep Connor. That's my advice to you because I think Connor is a very interesting pick. So I think that if you trade out Ayuk and Cooper for A.J. Brown and K9. I think that would be a trade where you're in business here, and I think that you would be the winner of that trade. So thank you yet again, Team Money, for offering up your trades. I think it's really not only helping me to interpret someone else's fantasy team, but others as well as they try to answer questions about theirs. So thank you for that input. But we do have to take a quick break right now. Coming up after this quick break, we're going to be talking about the QB situation, the QB market. In terms of the QB market, QB tiers, where all these players will end up going. So we'll be right back to talk about that after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked our first two segments. I know I did. Well, with all the comments coming in, thank you again to my man, Team Money, for all his trades, giving me an opportunity to analyze someone else's team instead of my own. So thank you for that. Keep it coming if you have any more. But we're getting into our third segment of today's show. We're going to be talking about QB tiers. It's been the big thing right now in terms of how to decipher the QB market. And you hear a lot, but that's not the right segment. We get the QB tiers here. We talk about QBs. We hear often, if you are in the fantasy football landscape and you have your ear to different pundits, even me, talking about the QB market, they say, pick a tier. Pick a tier of guys. You have to be comfortable with what you get. This year, especially, it's getting a little bit more crowded. So I hope that this segment will help you guys navigate whatever pratfalls you may face in determining how to choose the QB position, because like I said in previous episodes, there will be a lot of depth at this position going forward. Without further ado, let's talk about it. Obviously, let's start off with tier 1. Your no-brainers. Mahomes, Allen, Jackson, potentially Jalen Hurts. And I want to do something fun here where I say the guy who I think will drop out of this category and drop down a tier, and the guy who I think will cement his status, since it's tier 1, cement his status. And I think the guy who cements his status, obviously Patrick Mahomes, but I think Hurts and Jackson have the most question marks in this tier out of anyone. We talked about Hurts, both highly and a little bit lowly in terms of where he stands in the fantasy landscape. But he only spent 3 weeks outside of this kind of top 4 in terms of running backs. That's pretty impressive. And Jackson as well, averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game over his past 5 seasons in the league. It was really tough. But I think at the end of the day, Jackson just adds a little bit more value, in my opinion. Whereas Hurts is going to be in a season where he's going to face a lot of scrutiny in terms of getting back to what he was when he was an MVP candidate and trying to win a Super Bowl. So I think Hurts will drop down and Lamar Jackson will stay in this tier. But those 4 guys really are the cream of the crop. These are the guys you probably are going to get in round 6, round 7, early on. Then tier 2 is where it gets really interesting, because these are guys who either you're taking a little bit of a risk on, or you feel comfortable as a high-end QB1 or as someone who's a reliable backup. And in this tier, you have 2 guys going into their second year. One in Anthony Richardson, who hasn't even played that much. One in Stroud, who is trying to live up to what he did last year. Then you have guys like Kyler Murray, Joe Burrow, also a lot to prove, and Dak Prescott, who, might I add, was in the top 3 7 weeks out of last season. So he's a fantastic fantasy quarterback, especially in the regular season. But let's talk about guys who I think will drop out. I think when you look at it, Richardson probably is the guy who profiled as someone who will drop down a tier, just because we don't know much about him, even though if we did take that small sample size, he would have profiled as the QB1 in fantasy all of last year. And then we look at a guy like Joe Burrow, who also might drop down a tier if that wrist injury affects him early and often. But at the end of the day, I think he's safe. Another guy who I think might drop down a tier is Dak Prescott. What's up with him? I think that he is going to be a guy who a lot of people are looking at, especially early on in the regular season, because that was when he was at the peak of his powers last year. But this year, I think that we're going to view him through a different lens. A, if he doesn't get that contract extension, and B, if he doesn't really focus on anyone outside of CeeDee Lamb, even though, the Cowboys place a lot of emphasis on CeeDee Lamb. And this really is a prove-it season, even though last year kind of felt more like it for Dak Prescott. So he has a huge chance to either cement his status as a Tier 2 guy for the future, for wherever he ends up, even if he's not a Cowboy, or, see him drop down a little. The guy who I'm most excited about in this tier is Kyler Murray. I think a lot of people are undervaluing him. This is a guy who you might be able to get in rounds 9 through 10 even, and it will be a high-value pick. This guy was made for fantasy football. Coming back from an injury, I think that he will be very effective. Then, let's talk about Tier 3. These are the low-end QB1s. These are still guys who you will probably be happy with starting, but also guys who profile as reliable backups, or even in super flex leagues, where you start to really think about 2 QB setups. That's where you are. Love, Purdy, and shockingly, Jaden Daniels. Love was a top 10 QB last year, so out of all of these guys, he profiles as someone, but I still want to see more than one season out of him, even though, he was second in touchdown passing only to Dak. And then, Brock Purdy, what can we say about him? A system QB. He's not that exciting, right? But he is someone who just profiles as a steady presence at the QB position. He's not the most sexy of picks, let's be real, but he is someone. I have him on my fantasy team, and I hope for the best for him because I want him to do well for my fantasy sake. But at the end of the day, he's just someone who's a safe pair of hands. And then Jaden Daniels, this is a weird one. I think that he has the opportunity to either rise up or drastically go down this list of tiers here, because I would have thought Caleb Williams would be considered the rookie out of anyone in this class to be in this third tier. But right now, you have Jaden Daniels, who, while he definitely has a sneaky good group of weapons, he has Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, Austin Eckler, and Brian Robinson Jr. in that backfield. I really think that he still has a point to prove. And Dan Quinn is more of a defensive-minded coach, so we're going to have to see how that all works out. And then you have Aaron Rodgers as well in this tier. I don't think he deserves to be in this tier. I'm sorry, Aaron Rodgers fans, but a 40-year-old guy going into a season where he's coming off an Achilles tear, asked to do too much for what people are calling a premature Super Bowl contender, I just don't see it. I'm sorry, Jets fans. I'm sorry, Aaron Rodgers fans, but at this point in time, he just doesn't profile as a fantasy QB. He just doesn't profile as a guy who I would be comfortable with starting week in, week out. And so he also, I'm going to keep an eye on in terms of dropping out of this tier. But then you get to tier 4. This is where Superflex leagues, if you are in a Superflex league, this will come into play because these are your guys who are either your high-end QB2s or guys you put in that flex position. And those are your Trevor Lawrences, Caleb Williams, finally, your Jared Goffs, and your Kirk Cousins. This is an interesting group of players because you have a rookie, you have another kind of guy who profiles like a Brock Purdy in that he has players, weapons at his disposal so that he doesn't necessarily have to do too much. You have Kirk Cousins in a new home with an exciting young offense. And then Trevor Lawrence, who definitely has a point to prove, but I don't necessarily think it's his entire fault in him not progressing as people thought he would. And so this tier is kind of weird because in a normal fantasy draft, let's say in a 12-man league, not a super flex league, just a regular run-of-the-mill 12-man league, these quarterbacks will be highly coveted. But if I look at the larger landscape of things, these are guys who I also think have an element of risk to them. What if the whole Cousins experiment doesn't work? What if, for some reason, a piece on that Lions offense gets injured and Jared Goff starts to panic a little bit? What if, the whole Caleb Williams project doesn't work either? And also, I'm not as high on Trevor Lawrence as other people are. So this is where you start to see more and more questions emerge about these guys in this tier than ever. And to close it out, these are your really back-end QB3s, your Herberts, your Tuas, your Staffords, your Watsons, Geno Smith, and Mayfield. These are all guys, though, who I think very highly of, and I don't think that they should be considered that low should they not really pan out in terms of fantasy. Looking at someone like Justin Herbert, obviously I think he's just in this tier because of the Jim Harbaugh hire. He's not going to be throwing as deep as often, and he certainly does not have the wide receiver room to really compensate for that. I think that Tua is definitely interesting being in this tier because a lot of people will think more highly of him, maybe even overrate him as a tier 3. I know I kind of did, as he is my backup quarterback for this season, but I still think what with all the weapons at his disposal and the variability of that Dolphins offense, he has a very good chance to at least rise up to that tier 3 in my humble opinion. And then you look at a Matthew Stafford. Obviously, he also is getting up there in age. And the Rams offense, I really like Cooper Kupp. I really like Puka Nacua, breaking records left and right. Hopefully, he sustains that in his sophomore season in the NFL. But at the end of the day, Stafford is the question mark there. Because how long can he keep this up? How long can he consistently be delivering 3,000-yard seasons left and right? And I don't know the answer to that. And then you get to Deshaun Watson, who's always going to be controversial. Because he's also a quarterback where everything's on him. I feel like the Browns offense, yes, the O-line is banged up. Yes, you might get a compromised Nick Chubb later on in the year. Yes, your receivers are kind of getting up there in age, and the receiver you traded for doesn't necessarily profile as a guy who I think will succeed in this system. But I think the silver lining for someone who picks up Deshaun Watson is that he still has maintained his dual threat ability. He's still averaging about 5.2 yards per carry in terms of rushing as a QB, and that's a valuable asset. And if they can tap into that, I think that the Browns offense could be cooking here. And then Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield, two of my favorite QBs in the league and in this tier. Geno, not just because he's a Seahawk, but because, he is very up and down, very roller coaster ridey kind of QB. But at the end of the day, he's a very competent deep passer. Maybe not the best in terms of using his legs. He still does have that level to his game, but not prone to use it. But in this offense, look for him to get a lot of deep touchdown passes, get a lot of yardage in this offense, because what I'm hearing out of Seattle training camp is that Ryan Grubb has been very impressive in implementing his offensive game plan, and it has a lot of verbiage to it. And then Baker Mayfield, how can you hate this guy? I think that Baker just got disrespected just because the Browns were too late in realizing what his best assets were in the Bucs. Him under Dave Canales really was the secret sauce to unlocking the best of Baker Mayfield. Just get him into play action, and Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, a very balanced wide receiver group, Kate Otten, one of the more underrated tight ends in the league, and just let him cook. And I think that Baker Mayfield really just has a chance, along with, a guy like Geno Smith, to really elevate their game. And they're always going to be fun streaming options for you. At the end of the day, they may not start. But then, once we get into, say, the lower ends of the draft, you might, in a normal league, outside of the Superflex, be looking at guys like this. And that's the truth of the matter. But overall, let me know what you think of the comments about these QB tiers and whatever draft you are in and how you will think about them in the future. But we will be taking a quick break right now. Coming next, we talk about the running back position in terms of their tiers. We will be right back after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are in the home stretch of today's show. In our fourth segment, we will be continuing with this theme of tiers and we're looking at the running backs. Now, the running back landscape is a little more set in stone in terms of how I profile them. As Poets, Seers, and Sages says, I didn't consider Geno before, but I might give him a second look now. Well, I'm glad that after that segment, Poets, Seers, and Sages, you will be considering him. I love him as a Seattle fan. I think him getting a second chance in this league is such a fantastic story, and he lived up to it. Also worked under Dave Canales, so that Smith and Mayfield connection and that Dave Canales connection really is what makes me like these guys. So I'm glad that you are considering Geno Smith, and it comes from me, Poets, Seers, and Sages, so thank you for the comment. But let's get into the running backs, because the running backs are more of an interesting commodity, because like I said, they aren't as set in stone in terms of ranking them in tiers as the QBs were. These are guys where you can kind of pick and choose your poison here, because a lot more people employ the hero running back system or zero running back system than any other kind of strategy in fantasy. And so, if you are going to be employing that system, your strategy is like, how do I leverage your picks in all these different rounds? Instead of, just going by tier and thinking, okay, now that I know who's gone, let me pick based on what tiers people are projecting these players as. So without further ado, let's kind of break down more round by round than tier by tier the running backs. Obviously, in tier 1 is Christian McCaffrey, class of himself. Like I said in the previous couple of segments, he is far and away the best running back, best all-purpose player, perhaps in the NFL, best fantasy player. Yes, the injury history, blah, 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 but if you were picking round 1, pick 1, he is chalk. He is set in stone as the number 1 pick. Then, here's where it gets kind of interesting, because in the latter to mid stages of this draft, in your draft, you might be thinking about picking another running back. And if McCaffrey is already off the board, Hall and Robinson should be the next two guys to consider in the late to mid first round. And the reason why I think Breece Hall is kind of in this conversation is because he was third in scrimmage yards amongst running backs last year. And the reason why I think Bijan Robinson is in this tier is mainly because now feels like it's time to come alive in this offense. Now feels like the opportunity for him to really set the standard as being one of the best cornerstones for that Falcons offense. I don't think you can go wrong with either of these guys in the mid to late first round. Now, here's where things get even more interesting, because tier 3 is a clear drop-off from these three guys. We have CMC miles above everyone else, Hall and Robinson kind of in the middle, and then round 2 you get a little bit more open leverage here. So say you don't go along with the hero running back narrative, might wait a little bit. Then Jonathan Taylor, Saquon, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Derrick Henry become available to you. And I like all four of them, but the one who I'm really looking at right here is Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, we talked about Barkley yesterday a little bit. We talked about Jonathan Taylor on the show before, and we already know how I feel about Derrick Henry, especially in the Ravens setup. We haven't really talked about Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think Jahmyr Gibbs, even though the Lions are a team kind of centered around Ben Johnson, who have been getting the best out of Jared Goff, they also realize, even though they didn't do it in the NFC Championship game, sorry Lions fans, that they have value in the running game. Jahmyr Gibbs should have gotten the ball more in the NFC Championship game. I'm not harping on that. It's just a fact, because the Lions' run game is the very special sauce to what they do. It's not just all about, leveraging Jared Goff. it is about the running. And Jahmyr Gibbs in round 2 should go a lot higher than what people are expecting of him. Maybe even the first pick in the second round. So this tier is really up to your interpretation, because if you're one of those people who is willing to wait till round 2 when the running back market widens a little bit, then you should be comfortable with that sentiment. Then round 3 is your Pacheco's, ETNs, and Kyron Williams. And out of all of these guys, I actually don't like Kyron Williams as much as people are saying, just because he feels very much like a one-season wonder. I'm not sure how he will profile over more seasons in the Rams system, especially if Matthew Stafford leaves. I really think that people are underrating Isaiah Pacheco, though. I think that he adds a lot of value as a receiving back, and I think that Mahomes is starting to realize him as a weapon who may not be a traditional running back who can get in the open field explosively, but he is a guy who can get the job done. He's more of a workhorse guy. So if you do want that balance, you already have someone like a Hall or Robinson, let's say, Pacheco will be the pick for you. And then in rounds 3 through 4, that's where it opens up even a bit more. Mixon, James Cook, Josh Jacobs, Zamir White, a guy who I really like, Alvin Kamara. And let me talk about some of the pratfalls I faced in my draft. I ultimately drafted James Cook way too high. And I think that James Cook, even though he looks like in this new offensive setup for the Bills, like he will get a lot of targets and touches, I still think that he's not someone who, like me, you should be shrewd about and immediately going for. But at the end of the day, James Cook feels like someone who could be a steal. But a guy who I might fade out of this is Josh Jacobs, because I was talking about how the Packers are not necessarily a run-friendly system. I think that he's going to be used as a more smash-mouth back, and I think that's what he is right now. As he's getting older as well, he is becoming more smash-mouth oriented, more a physical guy, not a guy who can be that and also be explosive in the open field. But in terms of the running back tiers, I think that, like I said, it's not set in stone, but it's more about how the draft pans out. Let's say you have, say, the 6th or 7th pick in the first round. That means that you've already known what has happened before. You know what chalk picks have already happened, and now you can really focus on setting the future tone of the draft. You really have more power than people who are picking 1 through 3, because you have the power to take the draft in a different direction. If you see someone's picking, say, Justin Jefferson or Amon-Ra St. Brown, you can be like, hey, I want to continue this running back list. Let me pick a running back here. Let me see if it makes sense for me to pick either Taylor or Barkley, as Parker Bledsoe comes into the comments with another trade. I love this. I love this narrative right here. Should I take this trade? I get Achane, DK, Devontae Smith for JT, I believe that is Jonathan Taylor, Mike Evans, Dak, and Curtis Samuel. So this is an interesting trade because it has a lot of elements within it. So on your team, you have Jonathan Taylor, Mike Evans, Dak Prescott, and Curtis Samuel, and you get Richardson. Okay, I was wondering who AR was. So a 4-player swap right here. And then you, in return, get Achane, Richardson, Devontae Smith. This is a weird one, in my opinion. Because Anthony Richardson for Dak. Let's start off with the quarterback. These are guys who are really weird in terms of how I project them both. Because Dak is someone who I really liked early on in the regular season last year. He is a regular season guy, and he seems like he profiles, but that contract situation really is holding me back. And that whole narrative about how they feel like CeeDee Lamb is so important that they both waited and gave him the extension even before Dak began his own talks. That kind of gives me pause about him. Then let's go to the wide receivers you get. You get DK and Devontae Smith, and you are giving up Mike Evans and Curtis Samuel. We haven't really talked about DK on this show a lot. I like him. He's more of a late round guy, but he is one of those guys who I value in terms of balance, and I love preaching balance. So I like that. You lose Mike Evans and Curtis Samuel. We talked about Mike Evans, how consistent he could be, but if you're giving up Curtis Samuel, who I don't think will profile as highly on the Bills, I think that is someone that is a part of the trade that I think you are winning in getting DK and Devontae Smith. And then the running backs. Achane for Jonathan Taylor. I actually do not like Devin Achane, and here's why. I just don't like how the Miami Dolphins approach the use of speed. And I know it sounds weird because it's the thing that people expect them to get the most wins from, but if you have so many speedy players, the question becomes, okay, how do you divvy up the touches, the targets? And Devon Achane, let's remember, was a rookie last year, really came out of nowhere, and probably will not profile as someone who can keep up that level of stats. And Jonathan Taylor, I think, has a lot of hope and optimism for this season on the other hand. So I think this part of the trade is where I'm saying get rid of the Achane and JT part. But if we're just looking at DK, Richardson, and Devontae Smith for Mike Evans, Dak, and Curtis Samuel, that's an interesting part of the trade. Now, I think the whole question is about whether or not you feel Anthony Richardson will actually be better than Dak, because that takes a lot out of the trade as well. But I think that if you trade 3 out of those 3, then that's the most value. So thank you again, Parker Bledsoe. Very interesting trade because it's a 4-player trade. A lot of difficult narratives here, comparing and contrasting different positions and how you feel in terms of value. So thank you yet again for this. It was very helpful. I think that this trade will take us to the break, but keep them coming for our last segment. Our last segment will be talking about really, really deep sleepers. If you are someone who is willing to take a flyer on somebody, this segment is for you. We'll be back to conclude the show with that after this short break. Welcome back, everybody, to the final segment of today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. I know I have. Thank you guys yet again in the comments, especially those. Shout out to Team Money and Parker Bledsoe, who have offered up some trades for me to analyze. I love analyzing those trades. Hopefully, I have given you some decent advice going forward to help you out with those trades. I greatly appreciate it. Keep them coming if you want for me to analyze your comments. I greatly appreciate it. The show and the network will as well in turn. But our final segment of today's show will be concerning very, very deep sleepers. I'm not talking about guys who I've talked about before. It's Amir Whites and things like that. I'll talk about guys who I haven't talked about, haven't even deigned to talk about because, well, a lot of people would have been very shocked, skeptical, maybe even mad at me mentioning them in terms of being deep sleepers. But if you are ambitious, if you do like taking flyers in late rounds, like 10 to 12, then this segment is for you. So without further ado, let's jump right into today's final segment. And let's start off with a quarterback who has been getting a lot of buzz this offseason and is in a situation that is very weird. We don't often see it. A team who has picked up a quarterback in the offseason, acquired a quarterback, goes out and drafts another quarterback. Of course, the guy I'm talking about is Michael Penix Jr. A lot of you probably getting very skeptical, like, how is a guy who might not even start this year any games be a deep sleeper? Well, here's why. Michael Penix. You can talk about all the caveats here. You can talk about his age, even being the fact that he might not even start until he's 28 years old because he's 24 now. But should Kirk Cousins, who, mind you, is coming back from an ACL injury, either not live up to expectations or re-aggravate the injury, then someone needs to step up, and Michael Penix Jr., I believe, is competent enough to do that. Throughout his college career, yes, he himself has had a lot of injuries. Torn ACL at Indiana, knee problems at Washington. But he's played 48 games, averaging 12 games a season in college in 6 seasons, and 67 touchdowns. So, that level of consistency, that level of experience at the college level, translating it to the NFL, translating it to a team that really is in a bind right here, that really might need Michael Penix Jr. should Kirk Cousins either show his age, not live up to expectations, re-aggravate the injury, what have you, might need that contingency plan in place. Michael Penix Jr. could add some value. He's a guy that you might not take in the draft, might not even stream for the first couple of weeks of the season because obviously Kirk will be playing. But when it gets to the end of the season and either the Falcons are playing out the string or, Michael Penix Jr. has somehow won the job, I think that he is someone you might have to look at. And even in fantasy football drafts, there are some people who might take someone like a Michael Penix or a backup quarterback. And if you are one of those people, I'm not stopping you from picking him up. I feel like he's an interesting commodity this season. So, that being said, look out for him if in drafts you are that ambitious or as a streaming option later in the season. But another QB, a guy who does have more to prove than Michael Penix Jr. this season because he's going into his second season, highly underwhelming first season. But with a new coordinator, a guy we talked about, Dave Canales, working his magic with QBs, this guy seems primed and ready to go to have a big sophomore jump this season, and that is Bryce Young. I think that Bryce Young is really set up this year for success. I think that he has weapons now in Deontay Johnson, Xavier Legette, interesting profile there, Dave Canales, QB whisperer. And he has depth on the offensive line, so he doesn't necessarily have to, scramble as much in Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis. And so, what with them trying to paper over the cracks, and I think doing it to some effect, I hope, for his sake, Bryce Young is starting to become a more and more appealing fantasy option. Because at the end of the day, he still will have his legs as a use. But the problem was, he didn't have, the offensive line to protect him and bolster his ability furthermore to run the ball effectively, or B, have the weapons at the wide receiver and tight end position around him to fully trust. And this year, they're trying to build that. And Xavier Legette, he's perhaps my favorite wide receiver who's not named either Xavier Worthy or Marvin Harrison in this draft. I think that he has excellent body control. He can run vertical routes fantastic IQ, can contort his body to catch the ball in many different ways. And I think he profiles as someone who Bryce Young will have a lot of fun with. And Deontay Johnson is a nice little speedy option. Helps mitigate for, the deficiencies of guys like Adam Thielen. And hopefully Jonathan Mingo can get going here. But overall, the profile of this Panthers offense is starting to become more promising than it was last year. And, like I say, it can't get any worse, can it? So Bryce Young can be someone who you also might not draft immediately, but might be able to stream later on in the season. A high value pick there. Then let's go into more position players, because as we get into the season, position players will find themselves on the waiver wire. You might be thinking about picking one up should your own running backs, wide receivers, what have you, not be performing. And these guys will certainly almost always be available on the waiver wire. And I like them as well in the flex position if you do so draft them. Let's start off with a guy who my dad might like. Shout out to my father if he is watching. Bo Melton. My dad, will have mixed feelings about him because he is a Rutgers guy, but he plays for his rival team. But Bo Melton is an interesting proposition because I look at this Packers wide receiver room and I look at how young and youthful it is. The youngest in the NFL still. I think about how Matt LaFleur is going to incorporate all of these players, make sure that everyone's happy in the system, and analyze, most importantly, what traits in what positions of the field matter the most. And Bo Melton profile is someone who's very interesting. I think that at the end of the day, he's not always going to be the best performer because I still think, Jaden Reed will probably eventually profile as a wide receiver one. I like Wicks kind of as, that slot receiver, and then maybe a guy like Malik Heath will break out as a red zone or vertical threat or something of that nature. Romeo Doubs as well. But Bo Melton is always going to be a sneaky good guy. For example, in Week 17, he had a 22.5 fantasy point performance on 105 yards. That's a solid example of someone who later in the season had a game like that you may not have known about and could have picked up should you have felt like your receivers were struggling. And so you always have to play the chess game. Be aware of the waiver wire. Be aware of guys like Bo Melton, especially on a Packers team that doesn't necessarily have their mindset on, wide receivers and how they profile. So Bo Melton is going to be a sneaky little guy. Then the last guy is a guy who I really like. We've talked about this running back room and what it's looked like in prior years compared to this year. And this guy I hope doesn't sneak under the radar just because Derrick Henry is there. And that is Keaton Mitchell. Keaton Mitchell is someone who I really think should not go underestimated in this Baltimore Ravens offense. I hope and pray that Greg Roman will still utilize him to some effect. Because when I think about the Baltimore Ravens and I think about what their running back room has looked like in recent years, I've really loved their committee approach, focused around guys who can really bring out the best and supplement. As we get a tip from my mom, Meryl Shepard, shout out to her, $3 US, thank you. But we continue with the show here. Keaton Mitchell profiles as someone who represents that committee approach. Represents someone who is going to be not potentially the number one guy, because that's Derrick Henry right now, unfortunately, in my humble opinion. But he is someone who brings that explosive factor, could be a red zone factor. And interesting stat about him, the 26% of attempts that he did get last year, 26% of them were 10-yard gains. And he is someone who I just don't think the Ravens have to let fall to the wayside just because Derrick Henry is here. And in all reality, he could have been the starting quarterback this year, and I would have been fine with it, just because of how effective he can be in terms of how the offense is supplemented around Lamar Jackson. Because at the end of the day, Lamar Jackson, no matter how he profiles, is a dual threat guy who really likes RPOs, really likes to spread offense, and really will have a lot of open lanes no matter who is at running back, because that's how they set up their offense. But Keenan Mitchell is someone who can be a home run stream pick in later rounds should he, get more opportunities. What if Derrick Henry goes down? Then Keenan Mitchell can finally step into that role that I feel like he deserved. But let me know what you think in the comments. Even though we are winding down in showtime, we might get a little more time here. But those 4 guys, those are my deepest of sleepers. These are guys who you might not even draft or consider drafting, but could in the future be guys who you might A, stream, or B, find on the waiver wire later in the season, and they will find success for you and your team. That will just about do it for today's edition of the show. Thank you to all who have contributed in the comments. Thank you to all those who have tipped in the comments as well. Shout out to you, Mom. Also, reminder that you should like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you do feel so inclined. It's not just about comments. It's about getting a bigger brand for the network. We appreciate everything you do for us. Also, follow us on social media so you can look at some short content. We have a lot of shorts explaining what's going on in our shows. Be sure to check out my fellow podcasters as well. All of them are crushing it right now. Fantastic shows, fantastic content, all found in the GSMC Sports Network. But this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I have been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow. Thank you. Peace out.